So my name is Hongbin Li. I'm the faculty co-director of sccei, or the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions. For those of you who don't know us, sccei is Stanford's home for empirical, multidisciplinary research on China's economy and institutions. We aim to foster path-breaking research, create transformative student experiences, and advance public understanding of China and its impact on the world. We are very pleased to partner with the Stanford Alumni Association to offer this China Chess event series. So the goal of this China Chess event series is to host faculty talks, bringing the latest China research and insights from Stanford to our alums and friends around the world. With that, let me introduce today's speaker, my colleague, Professor Jennifer Pan. So Jennifer is a young star studying China at Stanford. So she is an associate professor of communication and also by courtesy of political science and sociology at Stanford. Her research resides at the intersection of political communication and comparative politics, showing how authoritarian governments try to control society in the digital age, how the public responds, and when and why each is successful. Her work has appeared in top peer-reviewed journals, such as the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, and Science. So Jennifer received her PhD from Harvard and her BA from Princeton. So here's some housekeeping. Today, Jennifer will talk for about 30 minutes about her research on information flow between global and Chinese social media. And then we will open up for questions from the audience. Without further ado, Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hongbin and sccei, for having me for this conversation. I really am looking forward to the chat with all of you who are here. So to start out, I think it's with a reflection that we are living in a world where social media is ubiquitous in our lives. Sometimes it feels impossible to imagine life before the internet, before social media. What do we do without Weixin or Douyin, Weibo, not to mention general internet connectivity? How can we have the types of conversations we're having without the connectivity that we have? And I think the thing to realize is that in many instances, we didn't. We were much less connected to other people, especially to people who are not in our immediate geographically proximate communities. So the internet and social media has allowed us to connect with more people more frequently in more places around the world. But those connections are restricted. There are restrictions to global connectivity and to global flows of information. Some of those restrictions, I think, are simply the result of user adoption of different platforms and different products. So even think back to 2011, most people in China use Weibo instead of Twitter, or think back even further when Twitter was not banned in China. So, but in addition, a lot of these restrictions are the result of government regulations and controls. I should say that governments all over the world have imposed and continue to impose restrictions on access to digital information using strategies from internet filtering to firewalls. I mean, today there are reports that Russia has blocked Facebook, Twitter, Google Play, Apple, App Store, etc. And as I'm sure many in this, probably everyone in this audience is well aware, nowhere is the effort to regulate the transnational flow of information or digital information more systematic and sustained than in China. The fact that YouTube, Facebook, Instagram are blocked in China means that users who are in the country are not on the same social media networks or same social networks as the rest of the world. But I think as this conversation will demonstrate, it's not the case that there is an absolute absence of information flowing into China from the global internet or from US-based social media platforms. So the research that I'm going to share with you today is motivated by a really simple question. The question is, how much information from non-Chinese social media platforms flows into Chinese social media? And in answering this question, we also analyze what types of information flow into Chinese social media from global social media, and who facilitates this flow of information. We've been analyzing data from focusing on two social media platforms. The first is Twitter, and the second is Weibo. We recognize that this is a subset of many other social media platforms, but because these are relatively comparable in terms of both the affordances and characteristics of the platforms, as well as daily active users, we think this is a relatively good starting point for looking at flows between the global and Chinese social media. I just want to note that for Twitter users, only about 20% of them are based in the US. So when we think about Twitter, some might think of it as a US platform, but in reality, users are really widely distributed around the world. So what we do is start with 14 million English language Twitter posts that are related to COVID-19, and they're made in the very early days of the pandemic, from January to April of 2020, which feels like a million years ago or just yesterday. We identify 1.8 million tweets that refer to China. So those 1.8 million tweets are about COVID and China, and they're in English. And what we do is look at the top 10 most retweeted tweets by week. So we focus on viral tweets and tweets explicitly mentioning both China and COVID, because these are the posts that are most likely to reach a larger audience in general and most likely to spread to China. So when I show you the results, keep in mind that this is likely a ceiling in terms of the inflow of information from global to Chinese social media. So what we do is search for these viral tweets in a data set of 6.7 million COVID-related Weibo posts. This Weibo data set comes from identifying, so what we do in getting access to this Weibo data set is first identify active Weibo users, about 20 million of them, collect all their posts, subset to the posts that pertain to COVID-19. And this is actually a data set that's publicly available and is a collaboration from researchers at universities based in China, as well as UC Davis. Okay, and I could talk more about the details of how we work with this data set if that's of interest. So we then are searching for the English viral tweets in Chinese language Weibo task. So this is a pretty challenging computational task. One, it's multilingual, and then it's also cross-platform. And even though we think of both Twitter and Weibo as microblogs, Twitter has a maximum character limit and Weibo doesn't. Obviously, the content is going to be written by different authors with very different linguistic norms. And we all just have a large number of candidate pairs that need to be evaluated for matching. So let's say we're just looking at N tweets and M Weibo posts, that's still N times M pairs that need to be compared and evaluated. So it's a really intensive computational task. It's too large for humans to do alone. But at the same time, because these posts that we're looking at tend to be very short, yet nuanced, it's quite challenging for a fully automated method to be able to find accurate matches. And so what we do is develop a system that uses deep learning as well as human annotation. So on the deep learning side, we're using a multilingual universal sentence encoder, which is a convolutional neural network, to identify the top 200 Weibo posts that are most likely to match each viral tweet. And then we have a bilingual research team to check which of those 200 retrieved Weibo posts are actual matches. And again, I'm very happy to talk more about the methods if people are interested. So, but I don't want to dwell too much on methods and get to the results. So this figure visualizes the viral tweets by date. So on the x-axis, you have our time period, January to end of April of 2020. Then on the y-axis, we have the log retweet count. So just keep in mind, this is a logarithmic scale. Okay, and my goal here is not to have these texts be large enough so that you can actually read them. What I want to show you is that we find about 44% of viral tweets appear on Weibo. So these are viral tweets about COVID and China in the first quarter of 2020 when COVID was just spreading globally. And another thing to point out here is that you see these co-occurring tweets, co-occurring content over the whole time period. So it's not concentrated at the beginning or in the later time period. Okay, but among the 44% of co-occurring content, only 13% first appeared on Twitter before appearing on Weibo. Okay, so we consider content that first appeared on Twitter and then appeared on Weibo to be those that flowed into China from global social media. Okay, I could talk more about, is that a right assumption? But what we see is that the remaining 31% of co-occurring content between Weibo and Twitter, they either actually moved mostly from Weibo to Twitter, or they appeared on both platforms at the same time. So let me give you an example of the second. On January 30th, 2020, the WHO declared that COVID was a global emergency. This information went viral on Twitter and on Weibo. So this information is going viral independently on different social media platforms at the same time. So we're not considering this a case where information is flowing into China. At the same time, we also see examples where viral tweets are coming from Weibo. So for the most part, because we're looking at COVID in the early days, most of these viral tweets were describing the situation on the ground in Wuhan. So oftentimes they contain videos that people had taken and posted on Weibo, but then were recaptured for Twitter, or just posts by people from Wuhan on Weibo that then others ported over to Twitter. Okay. I'm going to focus on the 13% of content that's flowing from Twitter into Weibo. And I'm going to focus on that because we know that in the US, there are a lot of China watchers who regularly are on Chinese social media, not only Weibo, but also Weixin and maybe increasingly on Douyin as well, to look at content there and to post it on US social media platforms like Twitter. But we know a lot less about how that information is going from Twitter to Weibo. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing slides, though I have lots of backup slides. So if people want to see more figures and tables, I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. But I just want to talk through the results here. If we focus on that 13% of content flowing from Twitter into Weibo, the vast majority of that, around 70%, are tweets that are critical of the Chinese government, critical of Chinese leadership, and or expressing discriminatory or racist attitude toward Chinese people. So this is content that's blaming Chinese people for the spread of COVID, blaming the Chinese government for not doing enough to prevent the spread in China and out of the country. So remember, this is early 2020. And this 70%, the fact that 70% of the content going from Twitter to Weibo is really striking because among all the viral tweets that we look at, less than 40% of content is this type of critical content. So in all the viral tweets, less than 40% is the stuff that's critical of the Chinese government, critical of Chinese leadership, racist toward Chinese people. The remaining of the viral tweets, the 60%, the more than 60%, this is now I'm talking about all of the tweets, not the subset that flows into Weibo. So among all these viral tweets, the 60% are describing the situation on the ground in Wuhan. They're asking for sympathy around the world for what's going on in China. They're asking the world not to engage in anti-Asian hatred, and they can contain calls to stop anti-Chinese racism. So when we look at the landscape of viral tweets, we see a lot of diversity. And there's this 40% that is highly critical of China and racist, and to a certain extent, but then there's more than 60% that is not. And in often cases, it's explicitly calling for support of Chinese people, both in China and around the world, who are experiencing discrimination. But okay, that's all the viral tweets, but the stuff that goes into China from Twitter overwhelmingly have this perspective of criticism toward China, the government, and Chinese people. And so those oftentimes, those calls for sympathy toward China, calls to support Chinese people, calls to support discrimination, they're not making their way from Twitter into Weibo. And just keep in mind that we are looking at the most viral tweets, so we're controlling for a level of virality on Twitter. So then the next question is, who is transmitting this information from Twitter to Weibo? Or more specifically, what Weibo accounts are posting viral Twitter content? If we look at absolute numbers, it's the accounts of ordinary people, or I should say non-VIP Weibo accounts that are responsible for, and they're responsible for posting nearly 60% of the Twitter content. So they make up most of the transfer of information into Weibo from Twitter. Another 30% or so are posted by individual VIP accounts. So this is Hongbin accounts or yellow V accounts on Weibo. And then the remaining 10% are posted to Weibo from Lan V or Blue V organizational VIP accounts. Of that 10%, half are government and half are non-government. So that includes companies as well. So many of the non-VIP, one thing to know is that many of the non-VIP accounts that are posting Twitter content onto Weibo are accounts that generally talk about economic, political, and social issues on Weibo. But they're not accounts with high numbers of followers. They're not verified accounts. And another important thing that we've noticed is that oftentimes they're citing news organizations. So even though we're looking at the flow of information from social media to social media, and it's a case that a lot of non-verified ordinary user accounts are posting content from Twitter to Weibo, they're often citing news organizations like BuzzFeed News. So they're not necessarily citing Chinese state media, but they're citing news organizations. So it seems that even though there's very much ground up mechanisms for the transfer of information from global social media to China, from Twitter to Weibo, news sites, traditional outlets seem to play a role, but they're often playing a role through their internet presence as well. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop there because I'm looking forward to your questions and I want to make sure this is a conversation. But I want to, so what have I said so far? There are three main points. The first is that there's very limited information flow from Twitter to Weibo during the emergence of COVID-19. When we look at content that is most likely to transmit from Twitter to Weibo. So we're looking at content around COVID, content about China, at the emergence of Weibo, at the emergence of COVID as it was spreading globally. This is when we most expect information to flow into China. And at that point in time, we see only around 10% of content that is flowing from Twitter to Weibo. Okay, the second thing is that when we look at information that flows into Chinese social media, a really outsized share is content critical of the Chinese government, critical, expressing criticism toward Chinese people and anti-Chinese sentiment. So we don't know exactly why this is the information that flows into Weibo. But one possibility is that some sort of confirmation bias is going on. And that would be good, that we can talk about, is that really going on or not? It would be going on potentially if people who are looking at Twitter and reposting content to Weibo kind of already have this belief in a narrative that China has suffered 100 years of humiliation. Now is the time for China's rise, but the West will not tolerate China's rise. So if the people who are looking for content on Twitter subscribe to that view, then seeing content that's critical of China is confirmatory. So seeing content that's critical of the Chinese government, that's critical of Chinese people, confirms that view that the West won't tolerate China's rise. And confirming people's prior expectations makes it potentially more likely that this content is what is shared. And I should say there's a lot of research showing confirmation bias influences how we seek information, how we retain information, how we recall information. So it's much easier for us to remember information that confirms for our prior views. So this is one possibility for why we see this outsized share of critical tweets, content critical of China, flowing into Chinese social media. And the third point is that accounts of very ordinary users are facilitating this flow of information from Twitter, English language Twitter, into Weibo. But at the same time, these ordinary users are looking at what is being posted and shared by traditional media outlets. So there's a role for kind of this bottom-up ordinary users, but at the same time, more traditional media outlets play a role. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions and to the conversation.
Thanks, Jennifer. So yeah, I see a lot of questions. First, can I ask a question, just some kind of like benchmark question? So if you do the same study to different platforms in the US, so such as like from TikTok to Twitter to TikTok, Instagram to Facebook. I'm asking this because different ages, different platforms. I mean, what's the benchmark? I mean, if you do US study.
Yeah, so I think it's hard to do it's somewhat difficult to do the US benchmark because we do find, well, okay, it differs by platform. I actually would think TikTok and Instagram, which we haven't looked at because its format is so different, the overlap would be quite low. But if we look at Twitter and Facebook, so I don't have an exact number for you, but my guess it would be a lot higher. But we don't know if information is transmitting or if everyone is just talking about the same thing at the same time. Because right now, if you go to Facebook and Twitter, there's a lot of content related to Ukraine, but it's not necessarily going from Twitter to Facebook. And I think that's one thing to emphasize in our results, which is I've talked a lot about kind of only 13% of content seems to be moving from Twitter to Weibo, but there is 44% of content is co-occurring. So that is a lot higher, but that information is going, at least temporally, appearing first on Weibo, then on Twitter, or appearing at the same time. Where when that's the case, we can't really ascertain whether things flowing from one platform or to the other.
I mean, another benchmark is that, so you're studying from like outside to China, right? How about the other way around, from China to other countries? I mean, is it similar or different? So.
Yeah, so we didn't start by looking at all viral Weibo content and then looking at how much of that appears on Twitter. That would be a different type of match because the firewall is for users in China, not for users in the US. But if we just look purely at the proportion based on our starting point of Twitter and looking at Weibo, a much greater share of that co-occurring content is content that first appears on Weibo and then appears on Twitter. So even though we're not searching the right way, about 13% is Twitter to Weibo. I think something like 40% or 50% is Weibo to Twitter.
Okay, let me ask questions from the audience. There are a lot of questions actually. So the first, I think you have, talked about this issue. So this person asks, how does the degree or level of sensitivity affects how much is transferred? I mean,
yeah, I think that is definitely something to consider. And I didn't show it today, but we actually analyze a different data set of Weibo posts that are pre-censored. So the data set that I'm collecting, I think others have this question is, so the data set that I showed you the results for, it's, so the collection method is identifying all active users on Weibo. So looking at accounts sequentially based on creation date and looking at which of those accounts posted in the last 30 or on a running basis, last 30 days. And then collecting the posts of all those users and then subsetting to those that are about COVID and are about China. But that's done retrospectively. That's not done in real time. And so that might be post-censorship. And so we look at another data set, which is collected out of academics in communication and journalism from Hong Kong. They, for over 10 years, have been collecting Weibo posts in close to real time. And then they check afterwards whether that content has been censored. When we look at that data set, we actually find something very, very similar in terms of both the proportion of content that moves from Twitter to Weibo, as well as what content is shared on Weibo. So it doesn't seem like, one reason why we might see all that critical content flowing into China is the confirmation bias that I talked about. But another reason might be censorship or self-censorship, that people think it's too sensitive to share calls to stop anti-Asian hate. I actually don't think that's the case, but maybe there's some sensitivity about the other content that's not being shared. When we look at the pre-censorship data set, that there really isn't any difference in explicit censorship. And if we think that people take a cue from explicit censorship as to what is sensitive and what are the lines that they don't want to cross, then it doesn't seem like that's really driving this. Although I think it's something that we hope to keep working on in the future, is looking at more types of events to see whether that proportion of content that's flowing in China changes.
Yeah, this question is about I think who are reposting this in Weibo. So I don't think you can answer the question. Do they live in China or outside China? What's their demographics? I mean, so.
Yeah, so we don't know for sure, because there might be Weibo users who say they're not in China but are in China, and are in China, say they're in China but not. So, but looking at what they say, if we take that at face value, what they say in their profiles, then all the accounts that are doing the transfer of information are based in China. But we can't really verify that because so few accounts actually allow for location sharing. So only 4 or 5% of accounts allow for location sharing, and we can't verify the location for most of the accounts that are doing the information transfer. But what we can know suggests they are China-based.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. This person asked 3 questions. One of the questions is that out of these reposting, how many of them are repetitive? It's the same message posting again and again. So basically, is it a campaign or?
When I say 13% of viral tweets appeared on Weibo, I'm talking about the tweets, and so some of those tweets we only find one match. We're looking at millions of Weibo posts and we find one match, but there are others where we find a lot of matches. But what I showed, the result I showed you is only counting the unique tweet and whether that unique tweet is appearing. But it's definitely the case that certain tweets get a lot more attention on Weibo than others. Hopefully that helps answer that question and hopefully clarifies what I'm talking about with the 13%.
So this question about how do you collect the data? So how can you collect like I think this is maybe our student. How can you collect like millions like piece of information? Is that free or you have to pay? Or
So I should be clear that the data collection so we're using 2 Weibo data sets, and the data sets that we're using in the results I talked to you about are gathered by 2 groups of researchers. The first is a group of researchers in China and at UC Davis who collected a lot of content related to COVID, and they've made that content public. And then the second is the folks who are doing some of you might know this or heard of this, but Weibo Scope and WeChat Scope data collection. So they are trying to get a sense of what is censored in mainland China, and they've had this collection for, I want to say, more than 10 years. So when COVID happened, they also published a public data set of pre-censored content related to COVID. So the analysis I'm showing you builds on both of those projects, and all of that data is publicly available to anyone, but I think mostly it's researchers who are using it.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So among all the reposts, how many are like pictures, like screenshots? So how many are like original? So just rewrite everything. How many are edited versions? And how many using like memes? So change the wording into something different, but it's the same thing, right?
Yeah. So I actually should say that I know that we often see screenshots of things on Weibo, Weixin that are from other occurrences. We're looking at text because our detection method is text-based, and we're not OCRing the attached images. And so that's something else we want to work on in the future. It's just much more computationally time-consuming to both collect the images and OCR them. And so everything I'm telling you today is based on analysis of text. So it's often people rephrasing or kind of copy-pasting into text what they're seeing, and then oftentimes translating it in Chinese. But I think we actually do catch more satire, sarcasm, memes, etc., because we're combining an automated search with human annotation, with kind of native Chinese speakers who also speak and read English, because they're the ones who are saying, is this a match or not at the end?
Yeah, this question is, this is, I think, about selection bias. So if some of the Weibo posting have been taken down, so you only see the remaining ones, right? So does it cause bias in your analysis?
Yeah, so yes, that could definitely cause bias, but we also look at Weibo posts that are pre-censored. So this is based on the collection from Weiboscope, which is collecting posts very close to as soon as they're posted, so close to real time. And when we look at that data set, the pre-censored data set, we find a similar proportion of Twitter content appearing. So it doesn't seem like it's kind of censorship, short-term censorship that is removing certain types of content. So I hopefully that makes it clear, but because I think you're definitely right to focus on the fact that maybe the type of content that we see appearing on Weibo is appearing because the rest has been censored. But when we look at the pre-censored data, we don't find more, and we don't find substantively different types of content that are appearing. Another thing that I want to say, which may be somewhat counterintuitive to people's expectations, is that I have a separate paper that looks at public sentiment on Weibo as COVID was emerging. So this is an analysis of what were people's attitudes toward about Weibo. What were they talking about? How are they talking about both local government, central government, etc. And there we use both the kind of post hoc, possibly post-censored data set, as well as the pre-censored data set. And we find that there's, again, really very little difference between the two data sets. And was very little content that was censored. So by censored, I mean deleted after it was posted on Weibo between January and April of 2020. And other scholars have published actually on that specifically, making that same point that there's very little censorship in that initial phase.
So this is a question about, whether China's digital communication, such as Weibo, WeChat, really reflect public opinion, and what's the style of this communication? How is different from like those in the West?
So I think that's a great question, and I think the most the best answer, I think, is to say that Chinese social media opinion reflects Chinese social media opinion, period. Some of my other work is survey based. And we these days are mostly using online surveys where we try to find as diverse of a population as we can. So we set quotas for age, for provincial geography, for gender, for education. But even those are not representative of the Chinese population, because even with online surveys, we're getting much more urban populations. And so you can think with something like Weibo, it's going to be more urban, more well-educated, younger. And I probably would say that in the last 5-6 years, as voices of certain types of accounts have been removed from Weibo, then in terms of opinion, you also have a particular slant. So not only is it a demographic subset, which is true, I think, for most social media, you then also have potentially some bias in the types of opinions that are now more likely expressed. But I think in general, it's really hard to know what that is representative of, because it's very hard for us to keep in mind those people who would have spoken had their accounts not been banned. It's really hard for us to imagine what they would have said now. So I think that's definitely a really important question, but not one that I have necessarily a very good answer for.
I mean, this question is about geography. So from both the source and destination. So where it's from, for them, which state of US, from Europe, or from which countries, right? The information. So when you reach China, is it posted in which province, which city?
Yeah, so I would say on the where is it being posted side of things, we can't actually tell, because people don't, a lot of the accounts that we're looking at aren't putting enough information about their geography in their profiles. But when we look at where it's coming from, it's overwhelmingly the US. So it's Twitter accounts based in the US. And I think that's really interesting, because Twitter is really global. 80% of Twitter users are outside the US. But yet, when you look at viral tweets during this time period, they were really dominated by US-based Twitter accounts.
Yeah, I mean, this question, I think it's a very long question, but I think it's about role playing. Could it be like the government agencies playing both sides, some criticizing the government, some just responding to it? They're different parts of the same people, actually. So could that happen?
So I don't know the answer to that question. I guess to clarify, is the question that there are kind of inauthentic or accounts that pretend to be an ordinary user, but actually are somehow government run? That are
about Wu right? So this is like 50 cents.
Yeah. So. I mean, so I don't think we know, because Wu can be genuine nationalism, right, or it can be government catalyzed. So the government spurring on genuine emotion, or it could be just completely fabricated. Right. And it's really hard. We don't have the data, kind of the ground truth data, to know what it is.
Can you differentiate like robots from like human? You cannot, right?
Well, if we define robots as automated accounts that exhibit the characteristics of automated accounts, it is absolutely not the case that the accounts that are reposting have those automated characteristics. So like really high volume of posting at regular intervals, networked with other bot-like accounts. We don't see signs of automation in the accounts that are reposting, but that doesn't mean that we don't know if they're real users or if there's real users but motivated by, incentivized by particular things or pursuing particular agendas. We don't really know.
Yeah, this question also about our why they are like negative messages posted in Weibo. So can it be that it's a government campaign basically to foment a Chinese victimhood in order to rally people behind government's like goal?
Yeah, so the evidence confirms that view, but I don't know that we have the evidence to prove it or disprove it. So it's confirmatory in the sense that these negative perceptions of China flowing in absolutely seem to align with the Chinese Communist Party's narratives that the West cannot tolerate China's rise and will challenge China as it's emerging in the world. But I think what we don't know, and this relates to the previous question, is do we see this content flowing in because this is a government mobilized effort to reinforce this perspective? Or is it that certain proportions of the public who are active on Weibo also actually subscribe to this view? And when they see content on Twitter that confirms this view, because confirmation bias is super powerful, they're resharing this content. And I think either one could be the exact mechanism, because there is this very large literature on confirmation bias that suggests that people are very prone to seek out, be able to see, recall, remember content that aligns with their prior beliefs.
So here's a research question. So your research technique is really interesting. So can this research be used to measure how the information gap between the Chinese social media and the Western media has changed, say in the past 5 years, as the government increased censorship and the Western reporters increased their like anti-China views, right, from both sides, right?
Yeah.
Has anyone done any research in this area over time to see how wide this gap has changed? How this will evolve in the future? Really...
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. The answer is I wish, but unfortunately the answer is no. So I've been doing research with Chinese social media data since 2010, and it's always been ad hoc. There's been no, and many others have been too, but there's no continuous data collection. And I think part of it is just that you need an infrastructure to have that continuous data collection. And as academics, sometimes we just like focus on writing. We have the data for one paper, and we'd have to invest a lot more to maintain that data collection because the UX, the APIs, everything changes all the time. That no one really has that sustained data. And so we can't look back 5 years to say, how has it changed? But I mean, one thing that I'm very interested in is actually building that infrastructure so that we can, going forward, have more continuous data collection. And also, I actually have a research project I was talking to a PhD student with on Wednesday, precisely about the expulsion of US journalists and whether that actually changes something about their reporting, whether it's frequency or their sentiment and level of criticism toward China. So that's actually a research design we can do because the expulsions happened relatively recently. So I think that's that's something that kind of more of the longitudinal look at things is something that we should definitely aim toward.
This question about, I mean, also long-term is about technology. So how do you think, I mean, this is a hypothetical question, the Starlink satellites like developed by Elon Musk and other people can change the whole, the firewall. How will that affect China social media users?
Wait, so the question is if there was no firewall?
If China can break the wall, so what will happen?
So I think my answer to this is that
we break the wall,
So there's a short-term answer. So this is all hypothetical. Short-term answer, and then a long-term answer. The short-term answer is I don't think anything would change because anyone who is in China using Chinese social media is already under a deluge of information. There's way more information than you could ever consume. It feels like an information-rich environment. And the demand for Twitter or YouTube is not high. And we actually know this empirically. David Young, who's at Harvard, and his co-author have shown that if you give at least college students in China very high quality VPNs, they're not going to use it because there's no demand for uncensored internet and uncensored information. So that's why I think in the short term, nothing will change. But then in the longer term, I think things might change both on the individual level as well as more of a kind of market level. So on the individual level, what that same research, David Young's research shows, is that if people are exposed to uncensored information, then they develop demand. So I think in the longer term, if there's uncensored internet and things flow in when there's a very salient global event, that can then change people's preferences for the sources, for different sources of information, as well as knowledge about what information is available. So there might be a change on the user side. And then I think on the market side, if there's no great firewall, then a lot of other companies would be very active in pursuing the Chinese market, and that would change the dynamics. Because I think, so when I think about the Great Firewall, I think of it both as something that limits information for people who are living in China, as well as a signal to firms that want to operate in China. It's a signal that if you want users in this market, there's a certain set of things that you must do. And so kind of the longer term answer, the influence might be on the individual as well as the market level.
Yeah, to follow up, so if you think about Americans, right? So even, I mean, we have access to all the information. Some people only watch CNN, some people only watch Fox. So they're different people, right? So, I mean, back to the China question. So for the Chinese overseas students or people who work here or study here, what kind of information they get actually? Do they use Weibo, WeChat, or do they use Twitter? Or...
Yeah, so we're doing the study of Chinese college students, both at top universities in China and also at over 60 universities in the US. We started following them in the fall of 2019. And so they're juniors now. And what we've found first is that the students who come to the US are very different than the students who are in China. So at the very beginning fall freshman year, the first year of college, their preferences and practices are different. Their demographics are different. On average, students who are coming to the US come from wealthier families. They're more coastal, so the kind of demographic is different. And what we've seen with Chinese students in the US is that they absolutely use Chinese social media, but they also consume kind of non-Chinese social media and also kind of traditional media. So they read New York Times, they look at New York Times, they look at CNN, some look at Fox News. They also go on YouTube, they also go on Twitter. So it's a much more diverse set of media channels that they're consuming.
Yeah, so this question is about, I mean, so those are really viral tweets flowing into China. How viral they are on Weibo? I mean, for example, the largest one, I mean, how many like retweets are recent?
It's not that high. But this could be, so our method doesn't really allow for us to see the level of virality on, doesn't necessarily allow us to see the level of virality on Weibo, because we're surfacing the top 200 most likely matches for human annotations. So we're just trying to see like which of the tweets appear. So there's our data is truncated on the Weibo side. But for the most of the content has very few retweets and reposts, like in the single digits. So Most people on Weibo are not seeing this, but there are a few that do get a lot of posts and reposts.
So this question is about why do these people post these like messages in Weibo? What are they doing actually?
Yeah, I think this is probably a question that my research can't answer, and which I probably will answer just based more anecdotally on why people use social media. What we know in terms of research about why people use social media in general. One is how I started the talk, is the connection. But why do people share kind of information? Oftentimes it is about self-affirmation. So you get a lot of likes when you share novel information. And that
But is that also, I mean, is it risky? I mean, to share some information? There's no risk.
Well, maybe that also drives the content that we see, right? I've talked about confirmation bias and others have talked about censorship, but maybe it goes back to that original question about political sensitivity. You post things that are novel and which you know are less politically sensitive. So you repost views expressed on Twitter that you are pretty sure won't cross the line and get you in trouble on Weibo. It's novel, so oftentimes it's sensational, so you'll get the likes and engagement, but it's less risky because it's a confirmatory view.
So this question is, if only 13% of the Twitter posts are reposted on Weibo during the high crisis moment, so during the pandemic, right? What do you think is the rate of information flow during the normal time?
My guess is it would be much lower. Yeah. And this kind of gets back to the sensitivity question, right? And in normal times on content that doesn't relate to China, it's less sensitive. But my guess is nothing is flowing in because China is its own information environment to a large extent. And there are different, people are engaging on the salient topics that are salient in China. You're not going to get much attention if you post on something that is going viral in the US. And so that's my guess, is that during normal times, the inflow would be even lower.
So this question, I don't know if you can answer the question. So what's the role of Hong Kong? So, I mean, I think there could be two dimensions. One is as an information center, right? The other is some social media in Hong Kong also has similar issues. I mean, as mainland China.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And you can potentially think that Hong Kong is a information broker in the sense that it's more connected to global social media platforms, or users there are more connected to global social media platforms and more connected to Chinese social media platforms, and that they're brokering. So hypothetically, maybe they're well positioned to broker information. But when we look at the Weibo accounts that are posting Twitter content, none are Hong Kong, or none appear to be Hong Kong-based accounts. So we don't find evidence that Hong Kong is playing a role in the information flow.
All right, I think we are almost time. Thank you, Jennifer. I think this is a very stimulating talk and discussion. And thank you all for asking the questions. Let's give Jennifer a big round of applause. I don't know, you cannot hear that, but I thank you all for tuning in today. Hope you stay safe and healthy, and we look forward to connecting you soon.